Welcome to Babblecom 5. This is episode 11 of Crusade by the DVD play order, The Needs of Earth. And this is one of the episodes which does outline the fact that there has to be a better play order than the DVD play order. Because we're again with the grey uniforms, and it's again increasingly evident that this episode was designed to be, in fact, possibly the first episode, because production order wise this is 101. So it's rather curious that we're getting it towards the middle of what would have been the first season. So yeah, kind of weird. That being said, it's a rather interesting episode. It's very JMS. It's sort of not at all what you might think, but then it never really misleads you either. So you're left to fill in the blanks and make assumptions about what it's going to be about, and then it turns out not to be about that particularly. So I will expand as I sort of run you through it. So one of these sort of ongoing premises, this sort of the running gag through this episode, is that it begins with Gideon having found some rather interesting material on a data crystal that Alison has given him, which was supposed to contain a report, but actually contained some interesting video files like Snow White and the Seven Narn, and Who's Your Little Pakmara? So basically, it's alien porn. It's alien porn with humans in. This is perhaps indicative of TNT's influence on Crusade, in that I think it wanted it to be a little bit raunchier than perhaps Babylon 5 had traditionally been. And I think we start to see that influence in the TV film, I think it was River of Souls, because there's definitely a bit more kink to it. I mean, this is an area that JMS explores a little bit more in Sense8, but that came a lot later than Babylon 5 and Crusade. So, you know, this is definitely, I think personally, a sign of a little bit of outside influence coming in. There's also a scene in this episode which is straight out of sort of, you know, any given wrestling show. So I really do wonder just how much he was being given notes very early doors with Crusade, and being required to put this sort of stuff in there, because again it was just symptomatic of the network that it found itself on, basically. But in any event, both Chambers and Gideon are now aware of the rather interesting contents of this crystal, but Gideon has determined that he's going to play it for all he's worth for the next God knows how long in order to make Alison squirm. And Alison does squirm later when he's on the bridge, when he's clearly realised which data crystal he's given Gideon, and he's saying, "Oh, it's corrupt. You shouldn't put it in your player. You should give it back to me immediately." Gideon then uses that in arguments against him later in a sort of subtle, not obvious fashion, but Alison knows what he's getting at. That much is clear. So the amusing video files aside, the episode begins in earnest when Anna-Shock Trulan comes on board from a White Star, and that means he's a ranger, and he outlines an interesting dichotomy, if you will, that the Rangers are basically there to protect the rule of law, and that is what they are all about. However, currently they are also tasked with hunting out anything that might be of use to the Excalibur's mission to find a cure for the Drac Plague. And Trulan says that up to this point there hasn't been any sort of conflict between those two, but now there is, because the information that he's learned about is not available through normal channels, and it would basically require Gideon to break a shed load of rules which Trulan can't endorse. So Trulan says that he can give him the necessary information if Gideon's willing to break the rules, but on that basis, this conversation never happened, which is an interesting one for Minbari, because Minbari aren't supposed to lie. But I am thinking that he will use the "I'm protecting the honour of another" get out of jail free card that the Minbari often do use to lie, because obviously there's a greater sort of purpose behind his lying. So what he tells Gideon is that there is a guy called Nuchok Var, who is a Maradi, and he is wanted by his people for having escaped their planet with basically the sum total of their knowledge. So hundreds of years worth of sort of planetary knowledge is apparently in his hands and is going to be sold to the highest bidder. However, there is a problem, because on the planet of Praxis, he has been captured by bounty hunters and his people are on the way to get him. But Excalibur is closer. So Gideon is going to have to go in and try and extract this guy from a colony which is outside the Interstellar Alliance. So the Praxis system is not within the jurisdiction of the Interstellar Alliance, which means Excalibur is going in with no authority to do what it's about to try and do. So that places the entire ship and potentially the mission in a certain degree of jeopardy, because they won't have any backup. So Gideon feels it's worth the effort, and they acknowledge that they don't know exactly what information it is that they're seeking out, but he figures that if it's the entire history of a planet, effectively, of a civilization, there's going to be something in there that's of some use to them, one way or another. So the planet they're going for is called Praxis 9. It's a nasty, nasty atmosphere there. So life exists there under 4 domes, one of which has a spaceport. And so Matheson's guess is that the prisoner will be being held in the spaceport, because that's where bounty hunters would come to and fro from. And Dorina basically says she's coming with because A, she's best suited for this sort of mission, being a thief, and B, she's already been there. So she has conveniently got very local knowledge of this dome, and she thinks that she can get her and Gideon in and out. So there's a nice sequence of a shuttle going out from Excalibur, going down to the planet's surface. We see a bit of atmospheric entry, always nice to see, that's realistic. They are dropped 6 miles away from the dome, and on the way towards the dome on foot, they rest for a moment, and she tells Gideon that she knows the dome because she wasn't on her homeworld at the time the Drak attack. She was often moving around and about the place, learning to serve, she says, which I'm guessing meant that she was sort of a slave at some point in some way, shape or form. It's just the way she said it was kind of interesting. The spacesuits are kind of, they're a bit sort of meh as spacesuits go. You can tell when they're sat down, there doesn't seem to be any real seal around their helmet where it meets the suit, which would be a bit of an issue. But anyway, Dorina basically makes it clear that it's like the local Mos Eisley. It's the port of call for smugglers, and all the lowlifes in the sector pass through this place. In order to get in, interestingly, she has to try and punch in a combination into the lock of the airlock that they get to, but she can't do it, she finds, with her suit gloves on. So she tells Gideon to take her gloves off, which exposes her to the atmosphere. So when they do get inside, she's half choked to death by then, because as I mentioned, it's a really nasty atmosphere. But she was willing to take the risk in order to get them inside, because that was, she wanted to demonstrate, I think, at what was actually an early point in the series, from this point of view, that she was willing to take this risk for him and for the mission. So once they're in, she figures out a sensible way to move things along quickly. because as we know, she is a thief. She's a member of the Thieves Guild. So she asks Gideon for a little distraction, and he chooses to punch the biggest guy he can find, which he immediately regrets because the biggest guy he can find isn't terribly impressed by his thump. So anyway, while Gideon's getting tossed around the place in a wrestling style, the Dorina sort of heads to a place where people aren't looking and activates a Thieves Guild symbol, and she sees that someone else is looking in exactly the same place that she is, and in that way she makes contact with a local member of the Thieves Guild. So as Gideon is conveniently tossed through a window just next to her, he picks himself up. They're met by that Thieves Guild representative, and she asks him, can he help them find someone urgently. So they do that, and there are a number of guards looking after the place where Nachok is being held, called the Red Jack Gang, I believe it was. But this time Gideon comes up with another idea for another distraction, and he puts Alison's pawn crystal into the local display unit, which of course attracts the various alien guards' interest as the Pak'ma'ra appears on screen, and it also distracts Dorina, ironically. She sort of tilts her head to one side to try and figure out what the Pak'ma'ra is trying to do. So anyway, distractions all round, and this does allow them to successfully rescue a rather sort of dazed Nachok. And Dorina also frees some other prisoners ostensibly as another distraction, but actually because she herself was once locked up in the same situation they were, and no one came for her. So she wanted to give them what nobody ever gave her, i.e. hope of freedom. So they managed to make it back to orbit, the Excalibur having sent down another shuttle for them. But the Miradi have arrived, and they're not far behind them. So the shuttle successfully docks up, and Excalibur starts to move off in normal space. But the Miradi have clocked them, and they give pursuit. Now, because the Miradi have just jumped in, they haven't used the local jump gate for whatever reason. Gideon reckons that their hyperspace engines might not have recharged yet, so he orders the Excalibur to jump, and they do. But unfortunately, it seems that the Miradi ship is quite capable, because it does manage to jump in after them. And it's fast, and it catches up with them, despite Excalibur going full tilt, and it fires a warning shot next to Excalibur. Now, Excalibur is a big, scary, tough, sort of Volan-y, hybrid-y ship. So in theory, it ought to be able to outgun this ship. But nevertheless, because they are transmitting an intention to sort of try and resolve things peacefully, Gideon brings Excalibur to a complete halt and decides to speak with their representatives, which makes a certain amount of sense, but I'm not sure that I wouldn't have tried to just cripple them and run in the circumstances. But anyway, that's what Gideon does. So it's quite entertaining in a sense. What then ensues, but meanwhile Nachok is being looked after by Dr. Chambers, and she's trying to scan him basically to help fix his wounds. But he will not give up the data crystals that he is holding on to. He's just carrying them in a little box, basically. And he explains to her that he wasn't intending to sell them. That was never the idea. The idea was to give them to someone deserving of them. And this kind of flummoxes her, and he notes that he understands why she would be puzzled, because it seems that his people were suggesting that was what he was going to do, because that suited them, and so that's why he's not surprised when he hears that from her. And instantly he knows their language, because he's made it his business to learn other languages. So Gideon is now faced with two representatives from the Miradi. One is a translator, and the other is basically His Almighty Highness something or other. and he doesn't lower himself by speaking other species' languages. So the translator and Gideon rapidly establish a sort of a quite a sort of entertaining rapport, where Gideon says to call his boss an ass, and he basically says that he's actually conveyed his deepest and most respectful respects to his boss. So they get each other, but equally it's also apparent that Gideon is going to play coy with them. He's neither confirming nor denying that their desired target is on board. It was actually quite interesting. I'd written myself a little note in my notes to say that it was one reason that Gideon might have chosen not to fight is that battles in hyperspace generally do not end well. It's one thing engaging a ship in normal space, but in hyperspace there are a lot of other variables and gravitic eddies and all this sort of good stuff. So generally speaking, you avoid it. Although that having been said, the Miradi opened up on Excalibur, so shots have been fired. But anyway, so Gideon sort of says, what are you going to do if I do have him and I don't give him over? And basically, the translator's boss whispers in his ear, and the translator basically says, it's not going to be a fair fight. And with that, we discover that bringing the Excalibur to a dead halt in hyperspace was not a smart move, because the Miradi are not alone. They have friends. And it's a nice bit of sort of space tactical awareness for someone like me who likes this sort of thing, because the Miradi ships don't line up in front of the Excalibur in a horizontal line. They take points around it in three-dimensional space, which means that they've got multiple vectors of attack, and the Excalibur has a tendency to have its main guns pointing forwards. It does have some turrets that can cover other angles, but ultimately, concentrated fire, it might still get overwhelmed. So it's not invincible, and Gideon knows that he's going to have an uphill struggle if he tries to engage that many ships. And the thing is that the Chuck also knows that, so he's not an idiot. And Gideon has a very open conversation with him, and he basically says that he's prepared to fight them, but the Chuck says, yeah, I understand that and I appreciate that, nevertheless you can't win it. So whilst these negotiations were happening, the Chuck has managed to find a data crystal that had Mozart on it, amongst other composers. And there's a whole sort of sequence where he's just kind of listening to this and clearly is both appreciating it and I think is relieved to have found it, because it means that he's found someone who he can give his data crystals to. So at his request, by his agreement, Gideon gives him over to the Miradis, but slightly strangely, he actually doesn't go on the same shuttle as the other aliens go back to their ships on, because they say that the translator explains that his boss won't sit with him, basically. So they send a second shuttle on autopilot to Excalibur to take him off and take him back to the Miradi ships. But it's Matheson rather than Gideon who oversees these arrangements, and Matheson kind of knows that something's up, but despite being a telepath, he resists the temptation to scan them. But you get the impression that he's kind of got some sense of something off them, but he lets them go anyway. But as soon as Gideon hears that the second shuttle is on autopilot and there's just Nachok in there, he immediately orders a fighter wing launched to cover them, but it's too late, because the Miradi ships take out the second shuttle, and that is the end of Nachok. But they did make a copy of his crystals before he went on board, so Excalibur still has the data, which he saw fit to pass on to them, because he felt that they appreciated or they would appreciate what was on it. And so there's nothing more Gideon can do. The Miradi ships form jump points and leave hyperspace, and Excalibur's just sort of left there. And he just tells Matheson to get them underway and just go kind of wherever, while he sort of sits and thinks about what's happened. So he then goes to Dr. Chambers and basically says, well, you know, what have we got? And what they have is basically creativity and hope, she feels, because the data that he's given them is actually all of his race's cultural recordings, readings, you know, music, all of that. Because one of the crystals makes it clear that what this guy was actually setting out to do was save all of this material from what he calls the final edict. So basically the state on his planet had decided that everything that wasn't geared towards bettering the state was frivolous and a waste of time and heretical and all that sort of good stuff. So they were burning all the books, getting rid of all the recordings, anything that didn't fit into this sort of new state-driven, straight-led way of thinking. And he believes at the time when he escapes his planet that he has the last recording of all of their cultural history, and he hopes that at some point their culture might shift again so that somebody actually asks for it back, and you know, he hopes that he will find somebody who can preserve it for them so that it isn't all lost. And Dr. Chambers very sort of eloquently points out that anyone can discover science. That's not a problem because it's always there and it's objective. But if someone destroys all of Mozart's works, that's it, they're gone. You can't recreate Mozart because it's a creation of thought. It can't be reproduced by the universe itself. So she feels that sort of the common driving factor behind all of their cultural works is the idea of hope, and Gideon is just completely dismissive of that as being of any value to his mission parameters whatsoever. So he just immediately starts talking about, okay, well, you know, we've heard of this medical ship from the Rangers, we're going to go and find that next. And Dr. Chambers just doesn't think that he gets it, because she feels that the needs of Earth are not necessarily wholly scientific at this point. Earth actually needs hope, and she thinks that this data could give Earth hope. So they have a difference of opinion, and as I say, Gideon sort of goes off to do his own thing. But it is a really, really interesting viewpoint that you know, just because it didn't have a cure for the plague doesn't make it worthless in any way, shape or form. So Matheson is recording his personal log, and he's debating with himself basically whether he should have let Nochok go, because he does get the impression that he knew, he was picking up enough that he knew that the Miradi were lying to him, but he thought they were lying about him getting a fair trial. He assumed that they get a mock trial. But then he thinks to himself, he's kind of berating himself, because he must have known that once that second shuttle was going to be on autopilot, something was up. But he found himself conflicted because he didn't want to reveal to Gideon that, however indirectly, he'd used his talents against the new rules that telepaths are supposed to be following. So in doing that, he kind of sealed Nochok's fate, but then equally, it was apparent that Nochok was prepared to accept his fate. So, you know, this is the Garden of Gethsemane theme that comes up in JMS's works from time to time. You know, was he going to be brave enough to accept his fate, knowing that they were going to off him, rather than giving him any sort of trial, because the state wouldn't allow his sort of mindset to continue to exist, sadly. And so Matheson's final comment to himself is it's ironic that he knows everyone else's heart, but he can't figure out his own, despite his talents. So it was the next scene that really sort of, for me, really sort of flagged the fact that this was an episode that should have come much earlier in the show's run. I think I already knew that from the uniforms, but this one is really obvious because Gideon comes back to Dr. Chambers and asks for one of the recordings and apologises, saying that he was out of line before, that they do need hope as well as everything else. And he is sort of upset about the death side of things, and she asks if it's because of the Cerberus, and she suggests that and he notes that 347 people died on the Cerberus, but it's she interestingly calls what happened to the Cerberus an accident, and he nearly contradicts her, because he knows damn well it wasn't an accident, but clearly the official line is that the Cerberus had a jump engine malfunction, and that's what caused it to be destroyed, with Gideon as the only survivor. But he doesn't correct her here. He doesn't set the record straight at this point. Now, we already know this from what we've seen before of Gideon being rescued by Galen, who doesn't appear at all in this episode and certainly isn't even mentioned. But I think this was supposed to sort of hint at that backstory for him, but not actually go into any details. So there's no flashback of the ship or the sort of shadowy sort of ship that we see in in earlier episodes, but what should probably have been later episodes. So it then turns out that Gideon isn't actually taking the data crystal for himself. He's actually taking it to Jadrina, because he feels that she needs hope more than he does, in light of what she told him about the circumstances on the planet. And it turned out to be worse than she let on, because it was actually her own family who had sold her into slavery on Praxis to remove their debts. And she doesn't actually blame them for that, but of course it did mean that she landed in that position as a result of them. And so, that just makes Gideon's gift to her even more important, and he just says to sort of give it back whenever she's finished with it. So, no mad rush, basically. So it's an interesting piece of her backstory to get now, as compared to perhaps we would have got it earlier, because obviously she doesn't then meet her people until much later in the series, or she would have done had this one gone where it should have gone, because as I mentioned at the start of the video, this was episode 101, so I can only assume that this would have been vastly earlier in one of the preferred play orders for the series, but it got shunted to the middle of the season. So up until the end of it here, it kind of made sense, because it could have just been another mission that they were on. But you do get the impression that these little bits at the end here are quite character building in many respects. So that was sort of quite interesting. I mean, Alison's character also gets a little bit of explanation around and about here. It's basically established that he's annoying as hell, so any opportunity they get to get one over on him is going to be a plus point for them. But more than that, we don't really see of him here. He's more sort of, he's doing the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few sort of spiel in this episode, on the basis that they should definitely go ahead and do this, because otherwise they how are they going to forward their mission? But he does think that there has to be a line they draw at some point, but this isn't the point to draw it. So the reason I find this episode interesting is that it's a good sort of 20 minutes into it before you realise that the information that they've got, that they've put themselves at some risk for, is essentially worthless to their mission. So that's very much contrary to what your legitimate expectations might have been in terms of how the episode is going to go. But as a result of that, we then get into a more sort of philosophical debate amongst the different main characters as to whether or not what they've done, what they've chosen to do, how they've reacted to it, how they've come to make their own decisions knowing what they knew, how they've come to those conclusions, which gives us an insight into them and to what extent they're willing to compromise themselves to achieve their overall mission. And that I find is quite an interesting way to go with it, because they could have spent the entire episode kind of running around and having fist fights with people and having space battles and lots of good stuff, but actually what we get is a much more thoughtful approach to it. And initially, the Dr. Chambers Gideon dynamic over the value of the data is very, very different, and they're at polar opposites. And we can see the value in what the guy was trying to do, because obviously he's trying to preserve the cultural history of his race, which seems a perfectly reasonable thing for him to be trying to do. For Gideon to then just sort of bin it off and saying, well, don't particularly care because we've got bigger fish to fry here. But then we see Gideon coming around again and acknowledging the fact that actually, yeah, in hindsight, having actually cooled down a bit, the Doctor's right and he was out of line. So that's good because it shows that he can learn from his mistakes and he's not that two-dimensional. So as an episode earlier in the series, this would definitely have made more sense to my mind. But it doesn't completely devalue it as an episode where it falls in the DVD play order. It just is another example of one of those ones where it's a little bit confusing because it's just this sort of slightly random exposition-y bits in it that you sort of think, yeah, but I already know that. Why are you expositioning me again? Because I already know this. But it isn't that. It's because the play order has clearly gone very out of sync with the production order at this point. We're at completely sort of opposite ends basically now in terms of where it should have come. But it's not sort of negative on the episode itself because it's not the episode's fault that it's been put in the play order in this particular place. The other thing I noticed just sort of in passing with this episode is that I thought that the rendering of the sort of the gas giant and the way they dealt with the planetary setting and really sort of blowing the wind and the smoke in, rather than it just being static and then being able to walk around without suits, that I thought was good because on other shows you don't necessarily see that terribly often. The Expanse did it very well actually, but obviously that's a long time after this. But the Expanse, because it was set in the solar system, obviously they had to do it right. So they had to wear suits and a lot of the time in the Expanse because of the way they played it. But you don't often get that on away missions in sort of standing science fiction, where they're going from planet to planet. So I did give them some kudos for that and for the sort of shuttle effect going in and everything else. It was nicely done, and even. I don't think you'd call the graphics particularly bad, even in today's terms. I mean, the Maradi ship was it was clearly quite heavily armed, but it wasn't terribly inventive looking. But then the thing is, spaceships don't have to look inventive; they just have to be able to travel in space, and that doesn't actually require loads and loads of bells and whistles. If you need to go into atmosphere, that's another thing altogether. But if you're just a spaceship, then you can look pretty much however you want, and it's fine. So what I did like about their ships was that they didn't look like anybody else's ships, and that's the thing that Babylon 5 has always been very, very good at, because all the different races' ships are always quite distinctive, so you can immediately spot which race the ship belongs to from the styling of its ships. So I think I like the fact that they don't kind of recycle generic stuff and reuse generic ships just because we haven't seen the race before. So, you know, I've always appreciated that about the series, I think, and it doesn't have to be fancy, it just has to be functional. That's the point. And in fact, you know, even in Crusade's quite short run, I mean, when I sort of think about it, we've seen quite a few different ship types for different alien races, which we haven't encountered before in the run of Babylon 5. So we are meeting quite a few new races just in the course of 13 episodes, and presumably that would only have continued, particularly if Excalibur does start going deeper range in order to find clues. So, you know, it's all good stuff. And again, just goes back to the fact that it's a shame that it got cut down before it really got going. But you know, you can see that things like this sort of, you know, the play order issues and all the rest of it. Clearly, it was always going to be a battle to actually get it onto the same footing as Babylon 5 was, because Babylon 5 had a much cleaner run at it, because eventually the studio just stopped giving them notes and JMS was allowed to get on with it. The complete opposite is the case with Crusade, unfortunately. So, you know, I can understand why JMS chose not to carry on with it and not to try and push it, because it would have gotten more and more broken as it went on, basically, unfortunately. So yeah. Right, well, that's it for this one. Strangely, I've only got 2 more left, which is a bit crazy. And then Lost Tales. So I will catch you for the next one. Cheers for now.